Hi, it's Global Politics with Jim Martin. Today I want to talk about the Ukrainian Operation Spiderweb. I'm sure that most of you have probably heard about this and know some details about it. I did not put out a video about it right away because I wanted to wait a couple days and let the smoke clear, so to speak, on exactly what happened. And I wanted to wait until some of the reports coming out had been verified by a couple of sources. If you aren't aware of this, it's quite an amazing feat. Apparently, Ukraine had purchased or leased some buildings in Russia, perhaps in Kazakhstan, which borders Russia. They had leased these under the auspices of shell kinds of companies that were nominally supposed to be construction companies of some kinds or manufacturing companies. And what they did in those buildings was actually to create prefabbed containers like you see on the back of trucks. In those containers, they installed drones with small explosive devices, about 100 per container unit. Then they shipped these to various locations in Russia, which happened to be close to major strategic bomber bases. Once they arrived in the general area, there were apparently remote controlled devices which opened the roofs of these containers, and then the drones took off and flew into these bases and struck their targets. Now, there's been some discussion that perhaps these were guided by AI algorithms that have been trained on the shapes of the various bomber aircraft. I don't know if that's true or not. That's unconfirmed, but it's an interesting possibility. Or the other alternative story is that they were guided by drone operators in Ukraine itself, which is also potentially another possibility. Nonetheless, the results are pretty incredible. The Ukrainians say that 40 aircraft were destroyed. I am guessing from what I can see from multiple sources of satellite info that at least 20 to 23 aircraft were destroyed. Some of them more important than others, but nonetheless, this is a critical loss. They lost at least one T-160 strategic bomber, which is akin to the US B-1B bomber. They lost perhaps 7 of the Tu-95 bombers, which are very old, but somewhat akin to our US B-52. They also lost at least 1 and possibly 2 or 3 IL-76 transport planes, which are something like our C-5 or C-123, large-scale, huge transport planes. And they lost 3 to 6 T-22 M3s. That's kind of like there's an older jet that I can't remember the name of that the United States had in service in the 70s. And most critically, they lost 2 A-50 AWACS planes. Those are particularly critical in that Russians only had like 6, maybe 7 of those total, and they've lost 2 of them in Ukraine that were shot down. One of them just over the border and one of them over the Black Sea. The AWACS planes, those A-50s, are incredibly expensive and very valuable. To put it into context, if you are fighting a near-peer adversary, or if you're fighting a peer like the United States or China, the modern way of air warfare involves having an air traffic control system, an early warning radar that is kind of coordinating where all your planes go to avoid air defenses, to avoid missiles that are inbound, to avoid aircraft that are in the area, these sorts of things. They can vector things and do all kinds of stuff. And they've done this in Ukraine quite a bit until they had to withdraw them to some safer distance because of losing a couple of them. in any peer or near peer conflict, to not have those available in greater numbers than 2, which is I think all they have left now, is incredibly dangerous for their national security. The other problem with all of these losses, which the Russians had perhaps 90 total strategic nuclear bombers. They've been repurposing them to launch cruise missiles and drop conventional munitions on Ukraine, but that's their purpose. It's a serious blow to the national security of Russia. The nuclear triad, submarines, land-based missiles in silos, and air power. You lose one piece of that triad, or a significant blow to one piece of that triad, it's a threat, it's a problem. It's not something you can ignore. Next up, the massive security failure that this operation represents. Even if the more conservative estimates on how many planes they lost are accurate, means that the Russians are going to have to check everything and everywhere using their security forces across the depth and breadth of the country, which is huge. Russia is a huge country. It's gigantic. And to have to cover all of that, because who knows, perhaps there are other trucks that are waiting in secret locations and all sorts of things. We have no idea. They have no idea. They're going to have to check everything, and they're going to have to check every shipment that goes anywhere. Compounding that, there have been some bombings of railroad bridges in various places. Most supply and logistics is not delivered by road in Russia because it's just simply too big. It's delivered by rail. Every bridge has to be checked. The logistics problems that these represent in a country which already has crumbling infrastructure due to years of neglect. Now, what's the cost of this entire operation? To the Ukrainians, I would guess, you think maybe you lease a few buildings for a year or two. So let's call that, given the economic conditions in the area, maybe $100,000. Then you've got obviously some personnel involved. You've got some paperwork. You've got some things to falsify as far as travel documents and things of that nature. People to pay off to get that done. Maybe we're talking about an additional $50,000. Then you're talking about the actual hundred some odd. Where are you going? You're talking about the actual drones themselves, which FPV, first person viewer drones, are cheap. So a couple $100 a piece. And then you have the shipping costs, maybe some random stuff to make everything look like you're legit. Maybe another $50,000, $60,000 on top of that. So maybe you pull this whole thing off for $300,000, $250,000, right around there, plus or minus. What were the costs to the Russians? Well, first off, you've got the actual material costs. So $7 to $8 billion in aircraft lost. The repair of any damaged aircraft is going to be difficult, if not impossible. Beyond that, consider that every single one of those bases, along with any base in the Russian Federation that has not been properly secured, is going to have to be, even the ones that weren't hit, you're going to have to secure those now. That's an immense cost. I couldn't even guess at it. Then you're going to have to think, our entire transportation sector is not secure. How are you going to secure that? And how much would that cost? And beyond that, the efficiency loss in the inspections that you're going to have to do and the paperwork that's going to have to be gone through and the investigation to track back and try to find out exactly how this happened, the infrastructure cost of, having to reroute things around the rail bridges that were blown up and checking all the rail bridges. It's a 9/11 level amount of government expenditure to attempt to secure a vast geographic area. Incalculable, really. Beyond that, there are other costs that we need to consider, and those involve us. When you consider that the Ukrainians pulled this off for something like, $250,000 to $500,000. And then you consider that the United States has bases just like this all over the place. And what would it take for somebody to do that? Creative, thoughtful people in our own security apparatus are considering that lesson right now. Our way of war is incredibly expensive and involves lots and lots of expensive equipment. We technologically overwhelm our foes and outspend them. That's how we won the Cold War. That's how we won World War II. These large-scale wars, that's how they're done. That's how we fought every war that we've been in for the past 50 years. This asymmetric approach to things is difficult and dangerous for us because it doesn't make sense to us in many ways. And you think about bases like Ellsworth and Minot and many others across the United States, that Whiteman in Missouri, that could be potentially vulnerable to exactly this sort of thing. And maybe it never happens, yet it has to be defended against when you have an empire as we do. And that doesn't even take into consideration bases that are overseas and places that are less secure than the United States itself. It's a new world in some ways. Now, is this a game changer? People say this for the Ukrainians against the Russians. Probably not, but it is a significant operation and a significant blow to the capacities of the Russian Federation and limits them in several key ways. I hope that brings some light onto some aspects of this that haven't been discussed widely. If you have any context on this or any thoughts, please feel free to share them in the comments. Please subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I look forward to talking to you again on the next one. Thanks. Bye.